The transport ship shook as it entered the atmosphere of Zarian Prime, and Jake Morrison gripped his seat while looking out at the endless orange desert below. The planet looked like a giant ball of sand with no green anywhere, and the heat waves made everything shimmer like water. His three teammates sat nearby, and each one looked nervous in their own way. HFY was the tallest of the group, with dark green scales that caught the light from the small windows. He came from a hot world, but even he seemed worried about this place. His yellow eyes kept looking at the desert, and his forked tongue flicked out to taste the air. The Vorthak people were known for being tough and proud, but Jake could see doubt in those reptilian features. Lumina sat very still, and her crystal body made tiny singing sounds as the ship vibrated. She looked like a person made of clear blue glass, with light moving inside her like trapped lightning. The Zeltharians could make their own food from sunlight, but they needed water just like everyone else. Her voice was like wind chimes when she spoke, and right now she was very quiet. Corvin took up 2 seats because of his size and his 4 arms. We're checking his equipment over and over. The Hiveborn looked like a giant beetle that walked on 2 legs, and his compound eyes saw everything at once. His people loved technology and machines, but Jake noticed that some of his gear was already making strange noises from the heat. The instructor's voice came through the speakers and told them they had 10 minutes before the drop. Each cadet would get basic supplies and 7 days to reach the pickup point 50 kilometers away. The rules were simple, but the desert was not. Temperatures would hit 60 degrees during the day and drop below freezing at night. Water was scarce, and shelter was whatever they could find or make. Jake looked at his gear and compared it to what his teammates had. HFY carried cooling packs and salt tablets for his reptilian body. Lumina had special water filters and mineral supplements. Corvin had electronic devices and portable shade makers. Jake's pack held a knife, some rope, a water bottle, emergency rations, and basic medical supplies. It looked primitive next to the alien technology. The ship's cargo bay opened and hot air rushed in like opening an oven door. The heat hit them like a physical force, and Jake felt sweat start immediately. His teammates made sounds of discomfort and began activating their special equipment. The drop zone was a flat area of sand and rocks with no shade in sight. They jumped from the ship one by one and landed hard on the burning sand. The transport disappeared quickly and left them alone in the vast emptiness. The silence was complete, except for the wind and the sound of their breathing. Jake looked around and saw nothing but desert stretching to the horizon in every direction. HFY stood up first and brushed sand from his scales while looking confident. His people came from hot worlds, so this should be easy for him. Lumina rose gracefully, and her crystal body caught the sunlight and threw rainbows across the sand. Corvin activated his shade maker and stood under the small shadow it created while his equipment hummed and beeped. The sun was already climbing higher, and the heat was getting worse. Jake pulled out his water bottle and took a small sip while his teammates checked their supplies. The smart thing was to move during the cooler parts of the day and rest when the sun was strongest. But first they needed to figure out their route and make a plan. Corvin pulled out his navigation device and frowned when it showed static. The magnetic fields on this planet made electronic compasses useless. Lumina tried to sense the direction by feeling the sunlight, but the heat was already making her crystals hot to touch. HFY looked at the sun and pointed toward what he thought was the right direction, but he wasn't sure. Jake knelt down and looked at the sand around them. There were small rocks and dried plant pieces scattered everywhere. Most people would see this as empty wasteland, but Jake saw something different. He noticed how the wind had carved patterns in the sand and how some areas had different colored dirt. There were signs here if you knew how to read them. He picked up a piece of what looked like dead wood but felt different in his hands. It was light and hollow and had small holes along its length. This came from some kind of desert plant, and it was designed to hold water. Jake broke it open and found tiny chambers inside that still held moisture. His teammates watched him with curiosity as he collected more pieces of plant material and examined them closely. HFY asked what he was doing, and Jake explained that these weren't just dead plants. They were tools that could help them survive. The Vorthak looked skeptical and said they should start walking before the heat got worse. Lumina agreed, and said they needed to find shelter soon or her crystal structure might crack from the temperature changes. Corvin packed up his equipment and said his cooling systems would only work for a few more hours in this heat. They all looked at Jake expectantly and waited for him to agree with their plan, but Jake was looking at something else now. There were white shapes scattered in the distance, and when he walked closer he saw they were bones from desert animals. The skeletons were clean and dry, and some of the larger bones looked very strong. His teammates followed him and wondered why he was interested in old bones. When they should be looking for water and shelter, the heat was getting unbearable and everyone except Jake wanted to start moving. But he knew that rushing across the desert without preparation would kill them all. He needed time to gather materials and make proper equipment. The problem was convincing his teammates to trust him when his methods looked so primitive compared to their advanced gear. As the sun reached its peak and the temperature soared past 50 degrees, Jake made his decision. He told his teammates they should stay here and wait for evening. The others protested and said they needed to cover distance while they still had energy. But Jake pointed to the horizon where heat waves made everything dance and shimmer. Nothing could survive walking in that furnace, reluctantly. His teammates agreed to wait, but they huddled under Corvin's shademaker and watched. Jake continued collecting what they saw as useless junk. The human worked steadily despite the heat, and gathered bones, plant pieces, and anything else that might be useful. His calm confidence was strange to see when everything around them was hostile and deadly. The first day on Zarian Prime was ending and already the alien cadets were starting to doubt their chances of survival. The temperature dropped fast when the sun went down and the alien cadets shivered as the desert became cold enough to see their breath. Corvin's equipment had stopped working an hour ago when sand got into the cooling vents. Lumina's crystal body was making cracking sounds as it contracted from the cold. HFY was trying to stay warm by moving around, but his energy was running low. Jake had spent the hot afternoon collecting materials, while his teammates rested in whatever shade they could find. Now he had a pile of bones, dried cactus pieces, and tough grass-like plants. His teammates watched him work and wondered what he planned to do with all the desert junk. The first thing Jake did was show them how to get water from the barrel-shaped cacti. He used his knife to cut into the thick skin and revealed the white flesh inside. The plant was full of small pockets that held clean water, and Jake squeezed them into his bottle. Lumina watched in amazement as nearly a liter of clear liquid came from what looked like a dead plant. Jake explained that these cacti were designed by nature to survive in the desert, and they stored water for months without rain. He showed Lumina how to find the water chambers by feeling the weight of different sections. The Zeltharian's crystal fingers could detect the moisture inside, and soon she was finding water-bearing cacti faster than Jake could cut them open. While Lumina learned about the plants, Jake started working with the bones he had collected. He selected long, straight pieces from the legs of dead animals and shorter, curved pieces from ribs and spines. His teammates thought he was crazy for playing with old bones when they needed shelter from the cold wind, but Jake knew what he was doing, and his hands moved with practiced skill. He used his knife to scrape the bones clean and then began fitting them together like puzzle pieces. The long bones became support posts and the curved ribs made perfect arches. He used the tough desert grass to tie everything together, and soon had the frame of a shelter. HFY was impressed, despite himself, and offered to help with his superior strength. Jake showed him how to anchor the bone posts deep in the sand, and how to angle them so the wind would flow around the structure instead of fighting it. The Vorthak's engineering mind began to understand the simple physics involved, and he suggested improvements to make the frame stronger. Corvin watched them work and slowly began to see the elegance in Jake's primitive methods. The human wasn't just randomly sticking bones together, but was following principles of load distribution and stress management. When Corvin pointed out a weak joint, Jake showed him how to reinforce it with additional bone pieces and grass bindings. Jake used the fabric from their drop containers to cover the bone frame, and created a surprisingly large shelter that blocked the wind completely. But he wasn't finished yet and continued working by the light of Lumina's natural glow. He took hollow bones and connected them to create air channels that would bring fresh air into the shelter without letting the cold wind blow directly on them. The alien cadets crowded into the completed shelter and were amazed at how warm it felt compared to the outside. Jake had even created a small fire pit using flat stones and was burning dried cactus fiber that gave off steady heat. The shelter was bigger inside than it looked from outside, and there was room for all four of them to sleep comfortably. But Jake wasn't done working, and he began creating tools from the remaining bones and plant materials. He made water containers from large cactus husks and lined them with plant fibers to prevent leaking. He created digging tools by attaching sharp bone pieces to wooden handles. He even made a simple compass by magnetizing a piece of metal from their equipment and floating it in water. Lumina asked how he knew to do all these things, and Jake explained that humans had been surviving in harsh places for thousands of years. Every technique he was using had been tested by generations of his people who lived in deserts, mountains, and frozen wastelands. What seemed like magic to his alien friends was just basic survival knowledge to any human dot as the night grew colder. Jake showed them how to set up water collection systems around their shelter. He positioned cactus husks to catch the small amount of dew that formed just before dawn. He angled pieces of fabric to channel any moisture into their containers. Even in this dry place, there was water in the air if you knew how to capture it. Corvin was fascinated by the mechanical simplicity of everything Jake created. The Hiveborn people relied on complex technology for everything, but here was a human solving problems with sticks and stones. Jake showed him how to create leverage systems using bones as fulcrums and how to multiply force using simple pulleys made from plant fibers. The night passed comfortably in their improvised shelter, and everyone slept well for the first time since arriving on the planet. Jake took the first watch and spent the time improving their tools and planning for the next day. He found more materials in the darkness and began preparing equipment they would need for traveling across the desert when morning came. The other cadets woke to find Jake had created even more useful items while they slept. He had woven sleeping mats from grass fibers that insulated them from the cold ground. He had made sun hats from cactus husks that would protect their heads during the day. He had even prepared trail rations by mixing cactus fruit with their emergency food to make it last longer. HAI tested the strength of Jake's bone tools and found they were as strong as metal implements. Lumina discovered that the cactus water containers kept their contents cool even in the desert heat. Corvin examined the shelter construction and realized it could be taken apart and rebuilt quickly at their next camp. The alien cadets began to understand that Jake's methods weren't primitive at all, but were perfectly adapted to work with whatever materials were available. Instead of fighting the desert environment, he was using it as a source of tools and supplies. The bones and plants they had dismissed as useless junk were actually sophisticated resources that could be shaped into anything they needed. As they prepared to break camp and continue toward the extraction point, Jake's teammates looked at the desert with new eyes. Instead of seeing empty wasteland, they began to notice the materials scattered everywhere. Dead wood that could be tools, rocks that could be weights, plants that could provide food and water. Jake packed his improvised equipment and prepared to teach his friends more survival techniques as they travel. The human approach to harsh environments was becoming clear to his alien teammates. Where other species tried to bring everything they needed with them, humans learned to find what they needed wherever they went. The second day on Zarian Prime was starting, and the alien cadets were beginning to see their human teammate in a completely different way. What they had thought was desperation was actually expertise, and what looked like primitive scavenging was really advanced survival science. The third day started with dark clouds building on the horizon, and Jake knew they were in trouble. The wind was picking up and carrying more sand than usual. His alien teammates saw the approaching storm and wanted to run ahead of it, but Jake shook his head. This wasn't a normal weather system, and trying to outrun it would get them all killed. Within an hour, the sandstorm hit. them like a wall of stinging particles that blocked out the sun completely. The wind howled around them and made it impossible to see more than a few steps in any direction. Zexhi's protective scales helped, but even he had to close his eyes against the blowing sand. Lumina's crystal body was getting scratched, and her light was dim in the swirling darkness. Corvin's remaining equipment failed completely as sand got into every opening in circuit. His communication device went dead first, then his navigation system, and finally his emergency beacon. The Hiveborn cadet panicked as his technological advantages disappeared one by one. Without his machines, he felt helpless and lost in the hostile environment. But Jake stayed calm and guided his teammates to a natural depression in the sand where they had some protection from the worst wind. He quickly began expanding their portable shelter using the bone framework they had carried. From their first camp, the structure bent and flexed with the storm instead of fighting against it, and soon they had a secure place to wait out the weather. The storm lasted 18 hours and buried most of their remaining supplies under shifting dunes. When it finally passed and they dug themselves out, the alien cadets saw that the landscape had completely changed. Landmarks they had been using for navigation were gone, and new sand hills blocked their planned route to the extraction point. Worse than the changed terrain was their supply situation. The storm had scattered and buried most of their equipment and food. Corvin's pack was completely lost under tons of sand. Lumina's water filters were clogged beyond cleaning. Even Zexhi's heat-resistant gear was damaged by the abrasive particles that had worked their way into every seam and joint. The alien cadets looked at their desperate situation and began to panic. They were still 30 kilometers from the pickup point with almost no supplies and no working equipment. The desert had beaten their advanced technology and left them with nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever Jake could improvise from local materials, but Jake wasn't worried and immediately began teaching his teammates how to rebuild their capabilities from scratch. He showed Zexhi how to identify the strongest bones for construction and explained the engineering principles behind load-bearing structures. The Vorthak's natural strength became crucial for building larger and more complex shelters. Jake taught Lumina to read the subtle signs that indicated water-bearing plants and underground moisture. Her crystal structure could detect chemical compositions through touch, and this ability became essential for finding safe drinking water. She learned to feel the difference between plants that stored clean water and those that contained toxins or salt. For Corvin, Jake demonstrated how simple mechanical principles could replace complex electronics. They built pulley systems from bones and plant fibers that could move heavy objects with minimal effort. They created lever mechanisms that multiplied force and made difficult tasks easy. They developed communication methods using reflected sunlight and shadow patterns that worked better than radio in the desert environment. The learning process was intensive, and the alien cadets had to abandon many of their preconceptions about survival. They had been taught to rely on manufactured tools and prepared supplies, but Jake showed them how to see every part of the environment as a potential resource. Sand could be used for filtration and insulation. Rocks became hammers and grinding surfaces. Even the bones of long-dead animals were valuable construction materials. Zexhi was the first to really understand Jake's approach and began suggesting improvements to their improvised equipment. His engineering background helped him see how human survival techniques followed the same physical laws as advanced technology but used different materials and methods. Soon he was creating his own tools and teaching the others what he had learned. Lumina's breakthrough came when she realized that her people's photosynthetic abilities could be enhanced by Jake's water collection methods. By positioning herself near his dew traps and moisture condensers, she could maintain her energy levels even when the sun was blocked by clouds or sandstorms. The combination of human and Zeltharian techniques created a system that was better than either approach alone. Corvin took longer to adapt, because his people had used technology for so many generations that they had forgotten how to work with their hands. But Jake was patient and showed him how to start with simple projects before moving to complex ones. Soon the Hiveborn was building mechanical devices that would have impressed his own engineers back home Dob as they worked together. The alien cadets began to see patterns in Jake's methods. Humans didn't just survive in harsh environments, but actually thrived by turning obstacles into advantages. Instead of carrying everything they needed, they learned to find or make what they required from whatever was available. This approach made them incredibly adaptable and resilient. The team spent 2 full days rebuilding their capabilities and learning from each other. By the end of this time, they had more equipment and supplies than when they started the exercise. Their shelter was larger and more comfortable than their original gear. Their water collection system provided more clean drinking water than their manufactured filters. Their improvised tools were actually more effective than the factory-made versions Jake watched his teammates master, techniques that humans had used for millennia and felt proud of their progress. HFY was building structures that would have impressed professional engineers. Lumina was finding water sources that electronic sensors had missed. Corvin was creating mechanical solutions that were elegant in their simplicity, but more important than their technical skills was the change in their thinking. The alien cadets no longer saw the desert as a hostile enemy trying to kill them. Instead, they viewed it as a resource-rich environment that could provide everything they needed if they knew how to look. This mental shift was the real key to human survival abilities. On the 5th day of their exercise, the team broke camp and continued toward the extraction point. But now they traveled as a unified group, with each member contributing their natural abilities enhanced by human survival techniques. They moved confidently across the desert and saw opportunities where, before they had seen only dangers. The harsh trial that was supposed to test their limits had instead become a learning experience that transformed them all. The alien cadets were no longer dependent on manufactured tools and prepared supplies. They had learned to see themselves as part of the environment rather than visitors passing through it. Jake led them toward their final challenge, knowing that his teammates were ready for whatever the desert might throw at them. They had become true survivors who could adapt to any situation and turn any environment into a home. On the 5th day of their survival trial, Jake and his team reached the edge of a massive canyon that cut across their path like a wound in the desert floor. The walls dropped straight down for over 100 meters, and the bottom was lost in shadows. Their maps showed this obstacle, but the reality was much worse than anyone had expected. HFY looked down into the canyon, and his yellow eyes tried to find a way across. The opposite rim was barely visible through the heat haze and looked impossibly far away. His reptilian instincts told him this was a trap with no escape, and his confidence began to waver for the first time since learning Jake's survival methods. Lumina approached the edge carefully, and her crystal body reflected the harsh sunlight into rainbow patterns on the canyon walls. She could see mineral deposits and rock formations that indicated this chasm was very old and very deep. Her people were good climbers, but even she knew that descending these walls would be suicide without proper equipment. Corvin examined their remaining rope and found they had less than 50 meters of strong line. The canyon was at least 3 times that wide and twice as deep. His mechanical mind calculated the physics involved and came up with no solution using conventional methods. They could not jump it, climb down it, or go around it in the time they had left. The other cadet teams would have been forced to call for emergency extraction at this point. Their advanced equipment and species-specific advantages were useless against a simple geographical obstacle. But Jake studied the canyon with calm eyes and began walking along the rim looking for something his teammates couldn't see. He found what he was looking for about a kilometer downstream, where the canyon narrowed slightly and the walls showed different rock layers. There were stress fractures and mineral veins that told him about the geological forces that had created this place. More importantly, there were places where the walls had collapsed and left piles of debris that could serve as anchor points. Jake called his teammates over and began explaining his plan. They would build a suspension bridge using bones as the main support structure and woven cactus fiber as the cables. The alien cadets looked at him like he had lost his mind from the desert heat. A bridge made from dead plants and animal bones. couldn't possibly span such a massive gap, but Jake had already begun gathering materials, and his confidence was infectious. He showed them how to select the longest and strongest bones for the main support cables. He demonstrated the tensile strength of properly prepared cactus fiber and how multiple strands could be woven together to create rope stronger than steel. HFY was the first to understand the engineering principles involved and began calculating load distributions and stress factors. His natural strength would be essential for positioning the heavy bone anchors, and his heat resistance would let him work during the blazing midday sun when the others had to rest. Lumina used her crystal body's unique properties to test materials under stress and identify weak points before they could fail. She could feel vibrations and structural flaws that were invisible to the others. Her ability to detect chemical compositions helped them select only the best materials for critical connections. Corvin applied his people's instinctive understanding of structural engineering to reinforce connection points and distribute weight loads evenly. He created pulleys and leverage systems that let them position massive bone sections with precision. His forearms were perfect for holding multiple components while the others worked on assembly. The bridge construction took 2 full days of intensive work, with each team member contributing their unique abilities. Jake coordinated the entire operation and taught them advanced techniques as they worked. He explained how ancient humans had crossed similar obstacles and how they had tested materials under extreme conditions. The main support cables were made from hundreds of meters of woven cactus fiber twisted together into thick ropes. These were anchored to massive bone structures driven deep into the solid rock on both sides of the canyon. The walking surface was created from smaller bones lashed together, with more plant fiber and suspended from the main cables. Safety was built into every part of the design with multiple redundancies and backup systems. If one cable failed, others would take the load. If one section of the walking surface broke, the rest would remain stable. Jake insisted on testing every connection multiple times before moving to the next phase of construction. The alien cadets were amazed at how Jake could visualize the completed structure while they were still working on individual components. His casual mention of similar projects during survival training on Earth shocked them. To their advanced civilizations, this represented master-level engineering that would require teams of specialists and sophisticated equipment. On the morning of the 7th day, their improvised bridge was complete. It stretched across the entire canyon in a graceful curve that seemed to defy gravity. The bone towers on each side rose like ancient monuments, and the fiber cables hummed in the desert wind. The walking surface looked narrow and fragile, but Jake's tests showed it could support many times their combined weight. HFY crossed first, his reptilian claws gripping the bone planks securely. The bridge swayed gently but held steady under his weight. Lumina followed, her crystal body creating light patterns that danced on the canyon walls below. Corvin came next, testing each step carefully with his engineering mindset. Finally, Jake crossed, checking the structure one last time as he walked from the far side of the canyon. They looked back at their creation and felt a mixture of pride and amazement. What had seemed impossible just days ago was now a solid reality that would let other teams cross safely. Jake suggested they leave markers and instructions for any cadets who might follow their route. The extraction point was now less than 10 kilometers away and easily reachable before the deadline. But more important than completing the exercise was what the alien cadets had learned about themselves and their capabilities. They had discovered that the combination of their natural abilities with human ingenuity created possibilities that none of them could achieve alone. HFY now saw every environment as a collection of building materials waiting to be assembled into whatever was needed. His engineering training combined with Jake's practical experience had given him confidence to tackle any construction challenge. He was already planning improvements for their next shelter. Lumina had learned to find resources in the most barren landscapes by understanding how life adapted to extreme conditions. Her photosynthetic abilities enhanced by human water collection techniques made her nearly self-sufficient in any environment. She felt connected to the desert in ways she had never experienced on her crystal homeworld. Corvin had discovered that simple mechanical solutions often outperformed complex technology in harsh conditions. His people's devotion to electronics had made them forget the elegant physics of basic machines. Now he could create tools and devices from raw materials that were more reliable than manufactured equipment. As they walked toward the final checkpoint, Jake reflected on what he had shared with his friends. Teaching them human survival techniques had been natural and instinctive. Every human learned these skills because their species had spread across countless hostile worlds by adapting to local conditions rather than trying to change them. The alien cadets chatted excitedly about the techniques they had mastered and the projects they wanted to try when they returned to the academy. They were no longer just students completing an assignment, but explorers who had discovered new ways of thinking about survival and adaptation. Their improvised bridge stood behind them as proof that determination and ingenuity could overcome any obstacle. The desert that had seemed so hostile just days ago now felt like an old friend that had taught them valuable lessons about resourcefulness and cooperation. The extraction point appeared on the horizon like a mirage shimmering in the desert heat, and Jake's team approached it with confident strides. Their improvised equipment clinked softly as they walked, and their water containers were still half full despite the week-long journey. Behind them stretched a trail of successful camps and solved problems that would have defeated most cadet teams. As they crested the final hill, they saw other teams already gathered at the pickup zone, and the sight made them pause in surprise. 3 complete squads were huddled in whatever shade they could find, and their condition was clearly desperate. Their advanced equipment lay scattered and broken around them, and their movements showed the exhaustion of beings pushed beyond their limits. The All-Vortex squad had used their natural heat resistance to travel during the blazing midday sun, but this strategy had drained their energy reserves completely. Their cooling packs were empty and their salt tablets were gone. 2 of their members needed medical attention, and the others were barely conscious from dehydration and heat exhaustion. The Zeltharian team had followed their species' efficient energy management protocols and rationed everything carefully from the beginning. But their precise calculations had not accounted for the unexpected sandstorm that had cost them 2 extra days. Now their reserves were exhausted, and their crystal bodies were showing stress fractures from the extreme temperature changes. The Hiveborn squad had relied on their technological superiority and sophisticated equipment throughout the exercise. Their devices had worked perfectly for the first few days, but the desert environment had gradually degraded their systems. Sand had clogged air filters, heat had fried circuits, and moisture had corroded connections until nothing worked properly. All 3 teams looked up as Jake's mixed squad approached, and their expressions showed disbelief at what they saw. The human and his alien teammates looked healthy and well-equipped despite having spent the same week in the same hostile desert. Their improvised gear was obviously functional, and their confident manner suggested they had actually enjoyed the challenge. Zexhai proudly demonstrated the bone tools he had learned to make and explained the engineering principles behind their construction. The other Vorthek cadets examined his work with amazement and asked how primitive materials could be so effective. He showed them stress distribution techniques and how to select the best bones for different applications. Lumina shared her knowledge of desert plant identification and water extraction methods with the struggling Zeltharian team. She guided them to nearby cacti and demonstrated the proper cutting techniques that preserved the most moisture. Her crystal fingers showed them how to feel for the water chambers that electronic sensors had missed completely. Corvin entertained the exhausted Hiveborn cadets with demonstrations of his improvised mechanical devices. Simple pulleys and levers created from bones and plant fibers could accomplish tasks that their broken electronics could no longer handle. He explained how basic physics could replace complex technology in survival situations. Jake organized the rescue of the failing teams and shared supplies while they waited for the extraction ship. His team's surplus equipment and emergency reserves were distributed to cadets who needed immediate medical attention. The bone shelters provided shade for everyone, and the water collection systems were expanded to serve the larger group. The instructors arrived in their transport craft and stepped out to assess the situation. Commander Thex was a grizzled Vorthok veteran who had designed this exercise to challenge each species' natural advantages. His assistant was Professor Kala, an elderly Zeltharian who studied interspecies cooperation. The third instructor was Chief Engineer Vox, a hive-born expert in survival technology. They had expected high failure rates from this desert trial because Zarian Prime was specifically chosen to defeat specialized approaches. Each team should have struggled with obstacles that their evolutionary advantages couldn't overcome. The mixed squad with the primitive human should have been the first to call for emergency extraction. Instead, they found Jake's team not just surviving but thriving in conditions that had nearly killed the species specialist squads. The human had somehow transformed his teammates into hybrid survivalists who combined their natural abilities with techniques the instructors had never seen before. Commander Thex examined the bone tools and structural components with his engineering expertise. The craftsmanship was impressive, but more important was the adaptability shown in their construction. Each piece was designed to be modified and reused for different purposes as needs changed. This flexibility was the key to their success. Professor Kala studied the plant materials and water extraction systems with scientific curiosity. The techniques showed deep understanding of desert ecology and biochemistry that went far beyond what was taught in survival courses. The human had somehow learned to read the environment like a textbook and extract resources that others couldn't even detect. Chief Engineer Vox was most impressed by the mechanical simplicity of everything Jake had created. Complex functions were accomplished with basic materials and elegant design. The improvised devices would continue working in conditions that would destroy manufactured equipment. This reliability was worth more than sophisticated features that failed when needed most. The instructors questioned Jake about his methods and were amazed by his casual responses. To him, turning environmental challenges into opportunities was simply human nature. His people had spread across countless hostile worlds by learning to work with local conditions rather than against them. Every technique he used had been tested by generations of human survivors. What shocked the alien instructors most was Jake's teaching ability. He had not just survived the desert trial, but had transformed his teammates into competent survivalists in just 1 week. Zexai could now build structures that would impress professional engineers. Lumina could find resources in the most barren landscapes. Corvin could create mechanical solutions from raw materials. The 3 specialist teams listened to Jake's explanations with growing understanding. They had failed because they tried to impose their evolutionary advantages on an environment that didn't care about their natural abilities. The human approach was to adapt to each new situation and find ways to use whatever was available. As the extraction ship prepared for departure, the failed teams asked if they could learn Jake's techniques. Their advanced civilizations had forgotten the basic survival skills that humans took for granted. They wanted to understand how primitive methods could be more effective than sophisticated technology. Jake agreed to share his knowledge and began planning training sessions for when they returned to the academy. His casual offer to teach survival techniques to entire alien civilizations made the instructors realize they were witnessing something unprecedented. A single human had revolutionized their understanding of what it meant to survive in hostile environments. The ship lifted off from Zarian Prime carrying 36 cadets who would never see deserts the same way again. The alien students had learned that true survival wasn't about having the best equipment, but about having the flexibility to turn any situation into an advantage. They had discovered that humans didn't just adapt to harsh environments, but transformed them into homes. Jake cleaned sand from his improvised tools as the planet fell away below them. He was already thinking about modifications for the next training exercise and wondering what other environments might challenge his teammates. To him, this had been a routine survival exercise, but to his alien friends it had been a revelation about the power of human ingenuity. The instructors would spend months analyzing the techniques Jake had demonstrated and trying to understand how human survival methods could be integrated into their training programs. They had designed an exercise to test the limits of different species, but instead had discovered new possibilities for interspecies cooperation. The bone bridge they had built still spanned the canyon on Zarian Prime and would serve as a landmark for future cadets. But more important than the physical structure was the bridge of understanding they had created between different ways of thinking about survival and adaptation in a hostile universe.